And it's a very general talk, but really the idea is for you to understand why this is personal to me, and that as a curator who specialized in the Gilded Age, I managed a historic house at a museum in Newark, New Jersey, and the museum was built on the site of a house where U.S. Grant and his wife visited because the family who lived there were close friends. So there were associations with New Jersey that I only learned after I got this job in New Jersey and worked there for 38 years. And only then did I start talking about U.S. Grant at all. I refused to talk about U.S. Grant because I didn't think I knew enough. The real gist of this is sort of my personal spin on it. I don't know when I first came to the cottage, but I was a lot younger and I came on my own. Maybe not with you. We brought our children here and they were completely bored because children in historical sites, I have a great picture of me like holding on to them so they won't get away from me on the porch. But so I'm starting this at the end, and I noticed that this image is all over. And I love this image very much, and I'll get back to why I care about it. But I wanted to start at the end because that happens here. And it's not the end of the Gilded Age, it's the end of U.S. Grant's role in the Gilded Age, but his impact will last for generations beyond him. And so to go back to the beginning is something, what I've done over the years, as I remember going to a meeting of the U.S. Grant Association when I had just joined it, because my mother said, I'm old, it's your turn now. And I went to a meeting in Washington and someone came up to me and said, so what was the last book on U.S. Grant you read? And I thought, what was the book? Only book, I'd never read a book on U.S. Grant at that point. I read Julia's memoirs first, and I've read those 3 times, and I recommend them highly because you don't get a woman's point of view very often in history. But I've read a lot of books and read a lot of authors. I met Ron Chernow, who wrote the great volume Grant on a Mississippi River boat in St. Louis. And he said, hi, I'm Ron Chernow. And I said, hi, I'm Ulysses Dietz. And then I Googled him under the table to figure out who he was. and realized that I had read his book on Rockefeller. But I never did read Hamilton. I read the first 10 pages and it wasn't in my house, so I left it. And at that dinner on the Mississippi Riverboat, he said, these kids in New York, they want to turn Hamilton into some sort of like a rap musical or something. Can you imagine that? And we laughed together and I thought, okay. Most historians do not hit that high note in their career. But it's people like him that got me, and reading books by people. So I only know stuff that I read in books. There is not a magical archive of family material sitting I have some photographs, but basically it's other people's writing has taught me what I know and taught me to appreciate it. And I'll explain, because I was teasing Mary about the great, because I'm the youngest of 41 great-great-grandchildren born to U.S. Grant. I was meant to be the youngest, but my little brother was a surprise. So there were 41 of us, and then he died when he was quite young. So I became the youngest. But that's why I'm Ulysses. I'm the only Ulysses out of 41 great-great-grandchildren. And there was only, in the generation before me, in my mother's generation, there were none. And in the generation before that, there were only 2. So, and I could bore you to death with all of this kind of genealogical stuff, but it was never a hugely popular name. And my mother, thinking it was the last grandchild, I was the 11th grandchild, that she said, and my grandfather had 3 daughters, and we'll talk about that too, but she named me after him, and he was appalled. Because it was 1955 and you didn't call a kid Ulysses anywhere. And so they called me Grant, which is my middle name. And so I grew up as Grant Dietz in Syracuse, New York. And nobody knew who I was. And it never occurred to me it mattered. Nobody talked to my mother because my family had a factory in Syracuse that had its name all over it, so they knew who that was. And it really wasn't until I was an adult, until I was in Newark working, and then got caught up in this Grant's Tomb thing in the 1980s, that I suddenly thought, this is embarrassing. I really should know this stuff, and somebody in the family should be paying attention to this. And Our son's middle name is Ulysses. I call him Uli Jr. sometimes. He doesn't think that's at all funny. But I realize that it's very hard in this world of presidential descendants, and I know a lot of descendants of other presidents now, to get people in the family interested. And because it's work and people are busy, or they're retired and they're lazy like me. And so this talk means a lot to me because I want people to understand this personal take on it, because it's about living history to me. And the reason that book, someone mentioned a book that I'd signed, which I hope the cottage is selling, but it was part of a book put out for Grant's 200th birthday, his bicentennial, in 2022. And I was invited to write an essay about the family, about the descendants. And that was such a thrill, but it's unusual for me to be included with a group of important historians anywhere. So let's start here, though, because this is way before the Gilded Age, but this is something that people forget, and Grant's own descendants tried to forget, is that these were children of the American frontier. And Ulysses and Julia are born 4 years apart in the 1820s. Ulysses on the near frontier of southwestern Ohio, and Julia on the far frontier of eastern Missouri, which, if your geography is at all good, and mine's not, I had to look it up, is rather far west from western Ohio. And they really are children of the 1820s, and they also together represent the entire history of the 19th century in America in just this one couple. Now, and I realized I forgot pictures of their mothers because it's very hard to find pictures of, there are almost no pictures of Ellen Dent, but here are their birthplaces. And Point Pleasant, Ohio, this little cabin, which they only lived in for a year or so, but it's right there near the river. And Ulysses was born to an ardent abolitionist family on the border between slave country and free country, on the river across from Kentucky, where a lot of his early education happened, across the river in Maysville, Kentucky. And he was born to Hannah Simpson Grant, a fiercely devout Methodist, Northern Methodist, who was so devout she never came to the White House, basically never left the house. And from her he gets his quietness and his introspection and his ability to think and talk under pressure. And then there's his father, Jesse Root Grant, who was raised with John Brown, the abolitionist, literally by Owen Brown, John Brown's father. So he grew up in this very fierce abolitionist environment. And he was a classic second quarter of the 19th century American. He was a striver, he was an entrepreneur, he was a loudmouth, he was a politician, and he was a very domineering father to his eldest son, Ulysses. And the names come, and I'm sure you've heard this, but his first name was originally Hiram, which was his mother's choice, and they pulled the names out of a hat, and it was a biblical name. And his middle name was Ulysses because it was a classical name, and it was about classical history. It's a Greek revival name, essentially, so I love that. Once I was old enough to understand that, I was glad I had that name. But he has these parents that Hannah is quiet and self-effacing because pride is the worst sin of all, and her husband, who is prideful beyond all recognition and adores his oldest son, but pushes him relentlessly to do things and accomplish things and be somebody. And he's the one, you know the story, he's the one who says, you're going to West Point, and his father, and he said, I don't want to go to West Point, and he said, you will go to West Point, and I think U.S. Grant says in his memoirs, so I guessed I would. And there he goes. And the difference is dramatic, and yet also another side of this is where Julia is born at what we grandly refer to as a plantation, but was really a frontier farm. You know, as I say, it's a dog trot that got dressed up. And I never looked to see if there were logs underneath that, but I was just there recently, and it was a different kind of family. Instead of this sort of spare New England Methodist family, this was a very high self-regarding Southern slave-owning family who moved from Maryland to Missouri in the early 19th century, 1814, when it was really wilderness, and moved not even in downtown St. Louis, but out on Gravois Creek to the west of downtown. And they had this farmhouse, and Julia and her siblings It's a 6-room house, and 6 children grew up in this house with the slaves living in the basement, the house slaves, the land slopes, and her rather high-handed father, Frederick Fayette Dent. Born at the same time as Jesse Grant, died at almost the same time as Jesse Grant. But he was a very different character. He saw himself as an aristocrat because he was a slave owner. He ran his farm. He did no work himself by various accounts. But I think of him sitting on that porch, smoking a cigar, and lording it over everybody. But he was a totally loving, devoted father. And this is something that in the history world today, if you owned a slave, you were an evil person. But it isn't that clean cut. And he adored his father, and it was he and his wife, Ellen Renshaw Dent. Ellen Dent, who predicted that U.S. Grant, who was seen as a complete failure when he married their daughter, would be president. She predicts that. And it's her diamond ring that becomes Julia's engagement ring. And I think has disappeared unless I own it. I'm not sure. But so these two very different types, a Southern American and a Northern American, both of them Western Americans by birth. And both of these men would visit the White House, and both of these men would drive each other crazy visiting the White House. Now, and then they had babies, which is what you did. It was this long courtship, and it's one of those things. There is a book in the gift shop. I can't remember. It's got this really campy cover with Grant hugging Scarlett O'Hara, apparently. But he wrote her these wonderful love letters. He was a very emotional guy, although all that quietness and reserve came from his mother. But I'm convinced that it was that the Dents taught U.S. Grant, and Nick Sacco at the Grant site in St. Louis believes this, that the Dents taught U.S. Grant how to be emotionally normal with people, which is why he and Julia were such incredibly devoted, loving parents. And this, I think on the left, this has just surfaced in the last 2 years. It's a daguerreotype that nobody in the family owned. We don't know why it was made, but this is the first known photograph of Julia, and I love it because she's looking right at the camera because she has no idea that she looks cross-eyed. She doesn't know that. And I think this is the photograph. She says, "Oh God." She wouldn't have said that because she was a devout Methodist too, but a Southern Methodist. And here she is holding my great-grandfather Fred, who is 4 years old, and little Ulysses S. Grant Jr., known as Buck, named by his father's slaves because he was born in Ohio, so he was the Buckeye baby. And there they are. Buck was the beautiful baby, and Fred was the dutiful baby. And there they are, and I've never seen that image until it surfaced, sold for some huge amount of money. And I've used this in a slide only because, look at her earrings. Because I'm a decorative arts curator, and I collected jewelry for the museum, and watching how women wear jewelry is really fascinating. So just to give you, that's my weird angle on this photograph. But it's also the very earliest one, and this is a much better known one, maybe even taken in Brady's studio, of Julia and Jesse and Nellie. And Nellie was born in 1854 on the estate at Whitehaven in a little house that burned down later. And Jesse was born also on the estate, and he was the only one of the children who lived at all in the log cabin hardscrabble, which I'll get to. But here are the 4 children spaced beautifully. There's a gap between 52 and 50. Well, that's not really much of a gap, so never mind. Between 54, no, that's only 4 years. Never mind. It's a very carefully planned family. And what it also struck me, because a lot of the mythology of U.S. Grant I grew up with, and it was all the bad stuff about him. He was drunk, he was stupid, he wasn't any good at West Point, he was a lousy president, he was a butcher at war, and he was a failure, he was poor. Well, in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, 2/3 of America were poor and struggling desperately through bank failures and weather changes, and it was a mess. Everybody was a mess. Any farmer in this country was struggling to survive. And he did better than most because he had a father-in-law who thought he was rich, and he had a father who was a skinflint, but was actually richer than the Dents. And this is one of those myths. The Grants had more money than the Dents. The Dents had 1,000 acre and 30 slaves, but the Grants actually, did I confuse myself? The Dents. But the Grants had a business that made money and actually had branches, and that actually was how Grant ends up in Galena. So I've recently been to Hardscrabble, and they don't talk about this, but I have a feeling Frederick Dent gave Grant see, this is not even the Gilded Age, and I'm going off on a tangent, but he gave Grant this big parcel of 200 acres on the north side of his huge 1,000-acre property, and said, you need to build yourself a house there. So they did this frontier thing of building. That's what Whitehaven looks like without the siding and the fancy front porch. It's pretty big rooms. But Julia hated this house, and I think she hated it because she knew her father encouraged U.S. Grant to build it, to take her away, so that he would be on the far side of the land. I mean, it's a few miles away, and on foot it's a problem. But then they changed that for, this is the house in Galena, Illinois, up on High Street, which is where they rent this house when he starts working for his father's branch office of the Grant and Sons leather goods store. They make bridle and tack and saddles and stuff. And it's an absolutely fine middle-class house for people in the middle of the 19th century. And even hardscrabble is as good as 40% of the American population lived in. So this emphasis, all of it developed in the late 19th century, that he was poor and she was rich and they lived this miserable life. He was never happier than when he was with his wife and children, and the money didn't matter. That's been emphasized wrongly by historians, because everybody struggled for every penny they got in the 19th century. And I'll tell you, the Dents didn't have any money. He started selling off land and his slaves because he had no cash, because there was no money being made in the late 50s as the war loomed. And these are two young people who are now married and have 4 children whose lives are completely changed, as the whole country's life was changed by war and technology, because the Civil War is the first high-tech war in America. And it's the railroads, which are just really developing in a big way, and mostly in the north, but also in the south. It's also the telegraph, and it's also things like this, the ironclad ships, the development of armored war vessels. And this is the siege at Vicksburg in a very dramatic scene. I doubt anyone took photographs of it, so I think someone made this up, but it's based on the descriptions. And over here is the other end of the war, or the other end of Grant's major part in the war. Because Vicksburg, and the reason the U.S. Grant Presidential Library is in Mississippi is because of Vicksburg, or at least that's the excuse we give. Privately, I can tell you a slightly different story, but what's so interesting is all through that war, so this war changes their lives completely, really for the better, even as it's tearing the country up and killing the largest number of people killed in a war in history, 750,000 people. Grant has his children with him. So Fred is with him during the battle, the siege of Vicksburg. He's not in the army, he's 14. And if any of you have ever had 14-year-olds, the thing they do best is disobey their parents and disregard orders. And they're in a war zone, and Fred gets on his pony and rides into enemy territory and gets hit by shrapnel. And as a result of that, he is in the Vicksburg Memorial for Illinois, with it, not the memorial, you know, the big dome thing at Vicksburg, alongside his father, because he participated in the Battle of Vicksburg against his father's orders. He got grounded, I'm sure, after that. And then toward the end of the war, when things have really turned, and I love this photograph, because it says so much. This is Julia not showing her face to the camera because she's so self-conscious, but it's Ulysses and their youngest child, Jesse, who I call the spoiled child, and I can talk, I may not talk more about that, but I can. But I love this. He's looking sort of relaxed and calm, because unlike any other Civil War general's wife, she followed him around as best she could. She went back and forth to Whitehaven, to wherever the war was, and she often had a child with him, and she always had her enslaved servants who her father had assigned to her when she married him. Her children, while her husband was fighting the Civil War to end slavery, were being taken care of by slaves so that they could move around the country with her. There's a kind of weird proto-feminist thing going on there, but she had no problems with it, and they were not freed until the Emancipation Proclamation. And I don't know if Ulysses told her to let them go, or they just finally went someplace where they were free, and they said, "We're out of here because Emancipation Proclamation, we're gone." And it was only in effect. It wasn't in effect in Missouri. It was only in effect in the South. So she traveled with them to the South with one of her children, and they left her. And she never understood why. So, you know, Julia. But this is the weirdness of the time. And this is where I always remember to point out to people that Mary Lincoln lost all of her brothers who were Confederate officers. So even Abraham Lincoln's wife was really caught on this edge. And then they win. And what does Galena do? But they give them, anybody remember there was a TV show, a game show called Dream House?
Yep.
You didn't watch that kind of crap TV, I guess. But they gave them a fully furnished sort of model villa on the fashionable outskirts of Galena, Illinois. And it sits intact. It's one of the only houses like it in the country with all of its stuff intact, because the family walked away from it in the early 20th century and gave it to the state. But it's an amazing thing, and Julia writes about it. See, I can't read this from here. You'll have to read it yourselves. But she says in her memoirs that they gave them a great parade, and they rode them around Galena in a carriage, and then they pulled up in front of this house and said, "It's all yours." And this is a pattern that keeps happening. People give him houses. He already had a house in Philadelphia that the Drexels gave him. He never had enough money to buy a house until after the Civil War. And I love this because it is a dream house. This was the fantasy of every American, to have an 8-room house with marble fireplaces, fully furnished. None of it's very fancy, but this is like the life of Riley. This is U.S. Grant living more comfortably than he had ever lived in his life up until that point. And for me, the Gilded Age starts with the end of the war, because that's when the economy of the South, driven by the value of slaves. Now, there's a label in a museum, so therefore I believe it, down in Memphis, that the value of the slaves in 1850 in America was, I've forgotten the number. I think it's $4 billion. And it's worth, the slaves were worth more than the entire rest of the American economy. That was the problem. Slavery was the problem, but it was also an economic problem. When that disappears, everything falls apart in the South. And all the industrial startups that have been booming all during the war, because all of the manufacturers are making war material, and the railroads are building, and the telegraphs are spreading west, and the profiteers are already taking advantage of the government to build railroads we don't need yet. But that's what happens. The economy shifts to the north, and that's why the Gilded Age begins. They don't call it the Gilded Age. Mark Twain names it that for sort of a different reason. But it's about natural resources like coal and iron and gold eventually, and silver. And then real estate, which is what all that stuff is in. And then you make stuff out of that stuff, and then you have to move that stuff around. That's retail and wholesale and shipping and manufacturing, and then the people. Oh, thank you. Retail, the bankers, the brokers, the lawyers. All of these people who existed but suddenly became crucial in the management, the manipulation of all these different moving parts in the New North. You know, eventually the New South would follow that along. Birmingham, Alabama is nothing and becomes a major industrial steel center by that same model during the Gilded Age. And it's hard to tell a Southern family that the city is a Gilded Age city. You didn't really mean anything before the Civil War at all. So the pattern will be repeated through the South. But the bigger thing in the story I'm telling you is that suddenly Julia finds that her husband is earning $20,000 a year as the head of the army in Washington. He has a big office. He reports to the president every day. And so she goes house shopping, and she says, they looked at a plantation in Virginia, and she said, that might not look good. Thank God she thought of that. And then they bought this big 4-bay house in Georgetown. And she says, she describes it, a large 4-story double house with grounds for $30,000 and 10 years to pay it. $30,000 is an enormous amount of money, so this is like luxury real estate. And then she shops, this is where I'm a curator. I'm a decorative arts curator. It's not about war and politics, it's about what people buy for their houses. So one of the things she does, she goes to Tiffany's and she buys this silver tray and puts her initials on it. And I don't know what it was for, putting glasses on, calling cards. But anyway, she could flash this, she could have her maid show all of her friends this silver tray from Tiffany's, and Tiffany was already the biggest brand name in America by the late 1860s. And that's the kind of thing she does. That is in the Newark Museum now, because it was mine. And in the early 80s, people were stealing silver, and I got anxious, so I gave it to the museum. So that's a great way to get people to give things to museums. And then 1868, people say, U.S. Grant ordered this Chinese export porcelain service. I'm saying, no, he didn't. Julia ordered it and said, Ulysses, I'm going to put your name on it, okay? And she did, and there's his monogram in a victor's wreath, and that becomes his logo. The U.S. Grant Association used that monogram as his logo. But that's what it is. It's a Roman warrior's laurel wreath. And it's all this elaborate Chinese porcelain. All this, what you see in the picture here was my mother's, and it all went to auction after she died. But the piece in the middle, the monogram in the middle, is the one piece that I still own. And then she bought a big set of flatware. She bought this in Philadelphia, but it came from New England. And I love it because all the pieces have either a Roman warrior or a Roman lady. So Ulysses and Julia. And so she was definitely thinking of herself when she bought this. Because this stuff matters to women. It really doesn't matter to men. And then they bought a house at the shore, and a country house on the beach in Long Branch, highly fashionable, brand new stick-style country house with porches all around. And that would be the summer White House. That would be where they would go on weekends before they lived in the White House. So this is a quote from Mark Twain's book, The Gilded Age. And a woman who is, let me set the stage. So a woman who has spent the entire book reinventing herself. She's a complete fraud, and she's working her way into Washington political society. And she's talking to one of the dowagers of old Washington society. This is 1873, this book's written. And she says, Long Branch and Cape May, both New Jersey, are nearer than Newport, nearer to Washington. Doubtless these places are low, meaning not classy. And the lady responds, nobody goes there, Miss Hawkins, at least only persons of no position in society, and the president. But Julia talks about what a boon our cottage at Long Branch was after the long, monotonous, exhausting weeks in Washington. They would all take the train to the Jersey Shore and sit on the beach, or sit on the verandas. I mean, you imagine the way they're dressed. They're not sitting on the beach. And here's a picture of, and you know, it's Ulysses and Julia and Fred, and Jesse. I don't know who the other two are. That's not Fred, and that's not another child. But the important thing there is the two African-American servants, one of whom was his valet during the war, who kept his tent and ironed his, not ironed, you didn't iron anything on the battlefield, but who kept him brushed. And so they had African-American servants always in their life together. And then the brass ring. He has this issue with President Johnson. You all know that, right? And someone has just discovered a picture of them at a dinner party together. And they both have glasses and wine in front of them, and they're looking at the camera with unhappy faces. It's a hilarious picture. But it was a very awkward time when he was trying to control the army and Johnson was out to destroy the South. And Grant didn't want the South destroyed. He wanted reunion. And that's really what triggers the movement to sweep him into the White House. And the brass ring, and I say this, I usually use this image because it's Julia who cares about the White House. She says, oh, finally, a house worthy of my husband and me. And these are both images of the White House as it looked at about the time of the Grant's arrival in 1869. And, but not all the family moves in because Buck is already at prep school in New England. Now I'll point this out. So Buck's birthday is the day before U.S. Grant's death, July 22nd. And that's my birthday. And we went to the same high school. And we're also the second son in a family of 3 boys and a girl. So I think so, even though he's not my direct ancestor, Buck and I sort of commune. And Buck is the bon vivant. He is the boy who marries a society girl and lives the big life. And he's also the one, well, we'll get into that. He talks his father into a very unfortunate decision. But here they are in the White House, in the Washington years, and I think early White House years. Julia and her father, looking like an old man, and Jesse and Nellie. Those are the children who grow up in the White House. And in fact, the White House, 8 years in the White House, it's the longest place they live ever in their lives together. The White House is Jesse's home, basically, as he grows up. So you can see why he's an arrogant little so-and-so when he gets out of it, because he grew up in the White House. None of the other, well, Nellie does something else. And Julia, and see, this is where my career triggers. I wrote a whole book on the White House called Dream House, and look at it from the point of view of what home was to American housewives and how the White House reflects that. There's Julia's, do not believe these colorizations. They're period, but I'm sure they're not accurate. But the Blue Room, as Julia redid it, she didn't get a lot of money from Congress in the first term, but she puts in this, she has a thing about crystal chandeliers. I could write a paper on that, I'm sure. So she puts this massive one in, and she redoes the carpeting and the curtains, but she doesn't get to change the Blue Room very much. And she doesn't get to change the state dining room much, but she puts in new carpeting, she puts in chandeliers, she expands the big centerpiece that the Monroes brought in. But she's living with this stuff from all the presidents who came before her, and she adapts to it. Because finally, though, she's got a palette to paint on. No, a canvas to paint on that's worthy. And speaking of canvases, we'll get to that. She buys all new furniture for the cabinet room from a fashionable maker in New York City. It's all still there, as a matter of fact. It's not in the cabinet room anymore, except that the current presidents see the cabinet table, that's what they use for their desk. So we'll think about politicians and male egos and how that is all about. Because there's a wonderful picture of Obama sitting at that as his desk. There's a picture of G.W. Bush with his feet up on it as his desk. So all the presidents have used that as their private desk, not in the Oval Office. But then she does her own thing. She does her own thing in the green room. There's nothing in the green room other than refreshed stuff. But she commissions a life-size equestrian portrait of her husband, which is so big that it doesn't even hang on the wall. It's leaning against the wall. This is by an artist named Cogswell, and I don't know if it still exists. But that goes in the green room, which is the official reception room for the East Room. So that's his room. She gets the red room, which is the family parlor. The red room is not a state room. It is the family parlor until the 20th century. So and this is from their house in Georgetown. What makes you think that you need to order a life-size portrait of your entire family? This is like the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills or something. And there's your time. But it's a life-size portrait of the entire Grant family by Cogswell with Julia at the center. Because this is her house. It's his government, but it's her house. And her children, her beautiful children, and her handsome husband is sort of behind her in a role of subservience. And he's in his uniform, because this is done for the house in Georgetown when he's still the commander of the army. And then she does, or maybe he does plan this, but then between the greenhouses on the west wing and the main house, she builds him a billiard room, which is what every Gilded Age millionaire needs. And it's his billiard table he brings with it. And there are all sorts of descriptions. This is a reconstruction because it got torn down 150 years ago, so nobody really knows what it looks like. But it was all these exotic polished woods and partly glass, so it was like this kind of glittering, woodsy family room that the family lived in, right off of the state dining room. So she really fits this house out to be a Gilded Age millionaire's house, because that was the model. Those were the people she was meeting now that her husband was president. Now, the dark side of the Gilded Age is economic total lack of control or regulation. And the first thing, and again, a lot of you know about this, but the first thing Grant runs into is the gold room scandal of Jay Gould and Jim Fisk trying to corner the gold market. This is Gould with commerce and the press, and he's got his little devil's horns and his pointed ears. And Jay Gould is, by the way, also a devout Presbyterian. He does not socialize, he doesn't drink, but he's considered one of the most evil men in the robber baron world. His house still exists in Irvington, New York. And his partner, Jim Fisk, who is poking with a pitchfork the animals of the gold room. So he's messing up the animals in the zoo. And U.S. Grant is running in with bags of gold to kill the cornering of the market. And what he does, of course, is he learns a lesson about not trusting rich men, because U.S. Grant's greatest Achilles heel, that's such a weird thing to say, it's very classical, it's good, is that he believes that if you're a rich man, because he's a Methodist, that you earned it, that you deserve it, that you're a good person. That's what he was taught by his parents, that money equals goodness. And he learns very fast that that's not true. And so Jim Fisk, and he's running with a bag of gold to sort of solve the problem. But a lot of banks go out of business because of that, so he earns his first economic enemies in the commercial world because he won't play along with their schemes. And there's a lot written about that, so I won't go into it. The second term in the White House, Julia gets more money. She gets a lot of, much. Second term, even though he's not as popular and there's been scandals, they get a lot more money, so she tears out, this makes me, as a curator, makes me cringe, she tears out the original 1817 staircase and puts in this big staircase so she can create what is now the West Sitting Hall, because the president's offices are in the White House. Half of the upstairs is taken up with presidential stuff, so she needs more space for the family, so that's what she uses for that. And then she gets to redecorate the Red Room. And in my world, in my curator's world, this is a very important set of furniture. She goes to the people who decorate for the Vanderbilts and orders furniture for the Red Room. And some of that survives, but only sort of by accident. That table is still in the White House. And then finally she says, ooh, that big, shabby, hollow blank of an East Room, which is huge, 40 by 80 by 22. It's the biggest room in a private house in America. It won't be long, but it still is. So she has this incredible renovation of the East Room done with these massive crystal chandeliers, 12 feet high, 3 of them right down. It transforms the house, and the room is all different. I would love to restore that, but she's proud of it. So she has the best ballroom in America for a while. And then, of course, the first monarch, the first sitting monarch, King Kalakaua from Hawaii, comes to visit the Grants and greets the president in Julia's room. So she's doing this for a purpose, to create a setting for her husband to be who he's supposed to be. But something happens untoward. She sent her daughter Nellie, who's 17, off to England to avoid fortune hunters, and she promptly falls in love with a fortune hunter who she marries in the White House in 1874. And there's the East Room decorated. U.S. Grant cried at the wedding, and he was smart, because Algernon Sartoris, and I know the Sartorises, I know his descendants who were my cousins, was a snake. And he wasn't the first, he wasn't the last snake in the family. And it made the cover of Leslie's. This is everybody looking at the wedding presents. And she's 17, she marries this 30-year-old who's sort of supposedly handsome. I've seen pictures, I wasn't impressed. And she goes off to England, and he promptly cheats on her and gets drunk and runs away and comes back to the U.S., leaving her stuck with her family, with his family. And as Henry James said, they don't like her much, but they like her better than they like algae. So there you are. So that's a sad story, and I won't go into that. But so Julia, but he adored his children. And one of the things I love about this is that Jesse writes that each of those children grew up feeling that they were the most loved child in the family. And then as adults, they compare notes and realize that they all felt that way. And that says something about parenting in the 19th century, that these children feel so loved, which also explains a little bit of why they make mistakes, because, we permissive parents know what happens when you let your children do what they want to do. And Fred was the one who got into the least trouble, let's put it that way. In the same year, with much less fanfare, Fred marries a gorgeous young woman from Chicago named Ida Honore, whose father is a real estate developer. Also, an immigrant into Chicago in the 1850s. Ida's born in 1854. And she's shown this way because she's pregnant with her first child, who is my great aunt Julia, and her husband Fred, and that hangs in my living room. This hangs in a cousin's house in Miami. How did it end up in Miami? She used to be in Colorado, but now she's in Miami. But this was a real love match and was an extraordinary marriage, but I won't go into that so much here. But here they are in 1876. And in this picture, Fred looks almost as handsome as Ben does in his Fred outfit. But Fred was never that handsome, by the way. And this is jumping ahead a little bit, but this blew my mind. So here is, in 1889, before they go to Vienna, this is my grandfather, U.S. Grant III, born in 1881. And there's his big sister, who is the one Ida is pregnant with in that last picture, born in 1876. She's Julia too. She's the second Julia of about 8 that have been in the family since then. And this is a great time, going back to the presidency, is that he has the president's salary. His wife is managing the White House quite brilliantly. She's a little extravagant, but she doesn't overspend, and she listens to him mostly. And here he is sending a letter off to Joseph Seligman, one of the great Jewish investment firms in New York City, $20,000 to invest. So he was making money, or he thought he was making money, and Seligman did him well. This check is in the Grant Library. because I think it's there's so much history involved in this. You all know about the notorious Order number 11, I think it is, when he expels all the Jews from Kentucky, the Jews as a class from Kentucky, which books have been written about, and I've read those books, because literally what happens is he says that word and he doesn't mean people who are Jewish. They're people with whom his father was consorting to illegally buy contraband cotton out of Kentucky so he could make money in Cincinnati. That's U.S. Grant's father, pushing him right to the edge. This order was rescinded very quickly, but it did a lot of damage, and it shamed him for the rest of his life. And he worked hard to, and one of the reasons he probably chose Joseph Seligman, because he knew his son from the Civil War. And then it comes to an end. I'm skipping over the White House because it's not really it's part of this big picture. So the sort of the great post-Civil War glorious moment when everybody all the wounds are healed, and all of the North and the South are reunited as one, with the opening of the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia in 1876. U.S. Grant on the podium, starting the Corliss steam engine that got the whole exhibition running on steam power, with a really very dodgy person, but the Emperor of Brazil, Dom Pedro of Brazil. I mean, it was a very tenuous empire, and Julia says in her memoirs, "I'm standing there right next to him, and they ignored me." So, she knew she had a role in all of this, but it was all about the men. And then, what do you do when you have no pension, and you have no job, and you've saved up money by wise investment with honest people? Let's spend it all and go around the world for 2 years, because that makes sense. It's a very American thing to do, I think. So they go around the world, which it's worth reading the books that have been written about their trip around the world, where U.S. Grant reveals himself to be the greatest diplomat the United States has ever produced. And he writes speeches and he gives speeches. This quiet man who couldn't talk gets up and talks spontaneously in front of every crowd he can see. He meets with the U.S. Grant of China, the Hongjiang, who knocked over the Taipei Rebellion, and I can't really tell you what that is, but it threatened the empire. And so I notice he's wearing white socks, and I don't know why that worked, but anyway. And then they come back, they spend this incredible time going around the world, and I'm totally fascinated. They literally visited every sitting monarch in the world, which is something no president has ever done since, or before. And then they come back to New York, and somebody's given them a $100,000 house just off of Fifth Avenue on 66th Street. And Julia says, "Oh, it was so big and so fancy and we couldn't afford it," but there it was. And they raised money so that they could afford to live in it. It's the craziest thing. It's probably illegal now, but it wasn't then. And I just point that out. It's next door. This is Fifth Avenue. And next door is the Havemeyers of Domino Sugar Money, who built this huge house right next door when Julia is still living there. And it's not the most glamorous house, but it's 27 rooms and 10,000 square feet. So not bad, right? And this will be where Grant begins his memoirs. But I'll get into that. And I just have to point this out, because this was published. The library and the parlor, Rosewood. There's the painting that was painted in Newark in the 1860s. And it's this very lavish modern house that is a symbol of their success. It's the brass ring again, only better. And here they are, sort of plump and grayer, and looking all the world, not like people from the frontier, but like people from the big city, members of the Gilded Age crowd, people who went to the Vanderbilt parties, who hobnobbed with fancy people, but they never really had as much money as they thought they did, which is why I say dancing on the edge of the Gilded Age. Everybody knew them, and not everybody liked them, because they were still Westerners, but they knew people, and they got along, and they mixed their way in. Hamilton Fish, one of the fanciest old families in New York City, is his most steadfast cabinet member through his career. And then the second chapter, and the one with the unhappy ending, is, and this was already mentioned, but the handsome bon vivant Buck says, "Oh, I got this friend, Ferdy Ward, and we're going to run a financial company, and we're going to make piles of money." And they do make piles of money until they stop. And they basically, essentially bankrupt not only U.S. Grant, but every person in his family loses everything they have to this scam, which was really like the well, the Madoff scandal, and it ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. Not as much as Madoff, but it was, for its time, it was enormous. And more importantly, is it's embarrassing that this is U.S. Grant again trusting someone who promised him wealth, who pulls the rug out from under him, and then he does briefly. I would say here's one of the good ones. William Henry Vanderbilt, in spite of his whiskers, is, and he's a ruthless businessman. He's the head of the Vanderbilt Railroad fortune, the son of the Commodore, and it's his children who build all the big houses in Newport and the big house in Hyde Park in New York. And there's his private art gallery and a book published that he had published about his house. Anyway, I won't even get into that. I could do a whole talk on that. But he gives him the money initially, $150,000, to stave off this bankruptcy. And it's not enough. It just, the house of cards collapses. And so he says, so he gives him all of his stuff from that house, all of his treasures, all of his military orders, all of the things they brought with them. And Vanderbilt wants to give them back. U.S. Grant won't take them. And they ended up in the Smithsonian because Vanderbilt gave them in honor of Julia when U.S. Grant died. And then on top of the bankruptcy, he's at the Jersey Shore house, which they have to sell, and he feels this pain. The famous story of he bites into a peach, and it's like a bee stung him. And he gets cancer, inoperable cancer of the throat, which is bad enough today, but back then when they literally could do nothing, and his response is, this is very streamlined, is to, I've got to write my memoirs so my family will have something. And you know that story because that happens here. And there is the Balmoral as it looked in the 19th century. Because as we were driving out here, I thought, what would bring people way out here in the 1880s to this little mountaintop? And maybe it's because it's a quiet cottage with fresh air outside of the city. And even Saratoga is kind of a dirty city. So, okay, we'll go with that. But there's the cottage as it looked, and Balmoral, which was over there. And then we're back to where we started with this death picture. And it's part of this thing of a good death, which is a real 19th century idea, that being able to prepare for your death is a very powerful Christian thing. And they gather to be with him. It seems more morbid, but in fact, it was their ultimate way of showing him love. And his ultimate showing them love was to put up with it, because he was in no mood. He was trying to finish this book. And there you have, so there's Buck and Julia and Nellie and little Julia and Ulysses and Ida and Fred and Nellie and Lizzie and Jessie. I think I got that right. And there are a lot of these pictures. I bought this one is a big format one that I bought and gave to the Grant Library because I wanted them to have a big one. But this is one of these iconic images that was probably in the newspapers in the period. And what always amazes me, and why I wanted to do this talk, is I knew these two people, and I talked to them. And my connection to this moment in history is direct because they were there. He was 4 years old, so he didn't really know what was going on. And you can see, he's a sullen toddler still, or a preschooler. And Julia's a little wiser, but the two of them are really close. And this moment in their lives, both as they remember it and as it's told to them, shapes them for the rest of their lives. And the famous last picture, and again he dies the day after his son Buck's birthday on July 23rd, and you all know about that, and that's why I'm here this week, is because of that. But he finished the memoir, and I tell you, when I get interviewed, I was interviewed with Jefferson Davis's great-great-grandson, who was quite a good friend, and I said, and we were both asked, what is the greatest thing you think your famous great-great-grandfather did? And he said something about finishing the Capitol, or approving the figure on top of the Capitol or something. And I said, writing the memoirs. Because, winning the Civil War is a good thing. But to write this mammoth book, and he wrote it himself. His son Fred helped, edited. But the manuscript survives. It's in his handwriting, every single bit of it, as he's dying of cancer and in constant pain. He writes 800 pages that becomes the greatest bestseller of military history and one of the greatest memoirs in American history. And it still holds that. It's still selling. It's never been out of print in all those years. I have 3 sets of it at home, in case you're wondering. Because somebody gave my mother a set for me when I was born, and they found out my name, and then my mother kept buying extra sets, so there you are. I have a lot of them. And there's always the problem of this. This is a reproduction signature. I get phone calls all the time. "Oh, I have a signed copy." I said, "They're all signed, it's printed." And that's why one of the reasons I love Mark Twain, and not just because he had a great house, which is still in Hartford, but because this was his idea. And he had made fun of U.S. Grant in the book, The Gilded Age, but became Grant's savior and best friend at the end of his life when he needed it most. And I'll tell you also now that that money is still there, but it's divided up among about 75 descendants. So I get $150 a year from the profits from the memoirs. And then he dies. Grover Cleveland, I know Grover Cleveland's grandson, so I put this into a talk I gave where he was in the audience. And Grover Cleveland is the president and speaks at his funeral. And you can read through this if you want. Because more important is Grover Cleveland is the one who signs the law granting Julia the $5,000 a year pension that a general would have gotten. Because the president still didn't get a pension. Even through Eisenhower, didn't get a pension. And here, and this is one of my favorite pictures, I do have a copy of this at home, this is the dedication of Grant's tomb. And there's Fred, my great-grandfather, Julia, Ida, Julia II, my great-aunt, who's only 19, and sort of hidden by the pole wearing a bowler, is my grandfather, who's 16. This is before he goes to West Point, and his life begins to follow his father's and his grandfather's. But that's not the end of it. And I've got a little coda here, which is just to show you what happens, that the legacy U.S. Grant left is more than winning the Civil War and doing what he did as president. His daughter-in-law, Ida, who was gorgeous, had a slightly less gorgeous but very smart and charming older sister named Bertha. And Bertha married the richest man in Chicago, where they grew up, who was 23 years her senior. His name was Potter Palmer, and she became one of the most powerful women in the United States because of her money and because of her wits. They built this huge castle where my grandparents spent part of their honeymoon on Lakeshore Drive. There's just an interior shot of it. But most importantly, Bertha Palmer has 2 sons who live in that castle with her and her older husband. And she takes Julia, my great-aunt, my grandfather's sister, Ida and Fred's daughter, under her wing. And she takes her to Europe in 1898 when her sons are out of college, and they go, as one does, you go on a tour of Europe for 5 months. And she takes Julia along, and this Russian prince they meet in Rome, whose brother Fred and Ida had met when they were in Vienna serving the U.S. government, and he comes down to the south of France and proposes to Julia, who has no money. At least, I can't imagine he thought she had money, but who knows. She was a famous general's daughter. And here they are getting married, and Mrs. Palmer says, "Okay, well, we'll rent a house in Newport, and we'll have a wedding in Newport, and I will win." And she does. She's from Chicago. She crashes Newport. She has this huge wedding in Newport in 1899. Fred is already in the Philippines, dealing with that bit of imperialism. And so my grandfather, who's in West Point, just started at West Point, walks her down the aisle. That's Julia, wearing a huge lalique piece, but you don't care about that. And her husband, Prince Michael Cantacuzene Count Speransky, of an ancient Russian-Romanian family. And there they are with Julia, Ida's father, Henry Honoré. There's Mrs. Palmer, and there's my great-grandmother Julia. We have no idea who that is. And there they are, this Gilded Age fantasy playing out in Newport. It's still a legendary story in Newport that this woman from Chicago came in and completely was embraced by Newport society because she was so good at it and so nice about it.
Which mansion was it, do you know? In Newport?
They rented a house, which is still privately owned by, it's owned by Dee Dee Wilsey now. It's called Bodia, and it had a tower, which was taken down in the early 20th century, but it's still a private house. But the Palmers had been to Newport several times, and Mr. Palmer would go to the clubs and just drink and play cards with the men. He couldn't have cared less, but she threw parties. And this is her ultimate party. And they moved to Russia, which is to say Ukraine. And that's not a sore point, I don't know what is. And they have 25,000 acres in this castle in Poltava in Ukraine, where she and her husband and 500 former serfs live. I don't know how many numbers I said. Hundreds of former serfs. She talks about how cute how quaint the peasant population was. They are an 8-hour coach ride from the nearest train station. It's really isolated. And then so Ida ultimately, even though she marries the general's son and doesn't have a lot of money, she's the one who has princes and princesses for her grandchildren. And here they are in Chicago. That's Princess Bertha and Prince Michael. But of course, the roll of the dice, it doesn't work out because they have a revolution. And that hasn't happened yet because Julia's still alive here. And so here's the two Julias. This is Julia Grant and Julia Grant Cantacuzene. So Julia's dream came true, and that this is her daughter dressed for a ball in St. Petersburg in 1901 with pearls and diamonds and rubies. And I don't know if she was happy. Just like Algernon Sartorus, her husband cheated on her from the day they were married. And eventually, there's Julia in Washington. She leaves New York City and moves to Washington, and that's her in her house. That's published in a big book of etiquette with lots of pictures. And there she is, just shortly, like months before she dies, in 1902. And so Julia didn't live to see either of her children unhappy. Well, she did. Nellie's living with her there. But the Gilded Age fantasy plays out, but it didn't play out quite the way they wanted it to. So I'm going to go on the other side. Her little boy Ulysses, just because this is the story, and I'm the only one that knows these pictures. He goes to West Point, even though he's never given a chance, because there's that famous letter written on the deathbed: "Give my baby Ulysses, my grandson, a place at West Point." So you're going to West Point from 3 years old. There he is, graduating from West Point in 1903. And he immediately gets a job because his father whines to Teddy Roosevelt, because they know each other from New York. And he gets him a job in the White House. And in the White House, he meets Edith Root, who is the Secretary of State's daughter, who is Alice Roosevelt's minder. And here they are going to visit the McElhennys of Tabasco sauce fame on the Mississippi River in 1901. This is a photo album I have at home. And he is delighted. Ulysses adores Julia right away, because she's not frivolous. She's not a society. I mean, she's a society girl, but she's smart. She's smart, but she wasn't allowed to go to college because she was a girl, by the way. And here they are. This is their wedding picture in 1907. Her grandfather had just died. Her grandfather wails. And so they're married in this house in Washington in 1907. And they proceed to do what they're supposed to do. They have children. So here they are. This is in 1912, because my Aunt Hancy is the baby. My Aunt Dee Dee is that's my grandmother. Dee Dee's there. And my grandfather, not wearing a uniform. He's still in the army. And then in 1916, tragedy strikes, and she has a third child, and it's my mother, Julia. And all of the telegrams are, "Oh, another girl, you must be so sad." And I asked my mother, I said, "Was your father, unhappy?" And he said, "No." She said, "No." He adored his daughters. He made sure they all went to Bryn Mawr because his wife couldn't go to college. And they were a very cool, Downton Abbey kind of loving but distant family. And she has nothing but happy memories of her father being an adoring father, just like his grandfather was. I think he was probably relieved not to have another Ulysses in his family until I came along. And there they all are climbing trees. And I've got to finish it, because Julia grows up, becomes a career girl. She's a blue stocking. She goes to London and hangs out, trying to see Virginia Woolf walking around. And then she meets this young banker named John Dietz. And then World War I and World War II breaks out, and they're not allowed to get married. He takes off after VE Day, comes home, and they plan a marriage 2 weeks away. And she tells Mom, "I'm having a wedding, get ready." And she goes to New Mexico to see my father's parents, because they can't travel. And then I don't know why she can travel, but she comes back. And here's their wedding. And there's my father at 26 years old. The first bomb is dropped on his 26th birthday. So they're getting married literally days after the war ends. And the result is the youngest Ulysses, the only one in my generation. And this is a rare picture because I'm smiling and I'm missing half my teeth. And the photographer, my mother said, no, we can't use that one. So the one that they used for the Christmas card in 1962 is me looking very sad. When I wasn't a sad child at all. So there we all are, and that's the end of my talk. Thank you.